You want Cleopatra? Fine. Here is the truth. Octavian's Rome did not defeat me only with ships. It defeated me by deciding what I would mean. Memory is a battlefield. Now, don't treat my name as proof. Treat this as a mechanism you can test. People think they know me because they've been given a very convenient picture. A woman reduced to perfume and spectacle. An empire toppled by a pair of eyes. That picture is not merely wrong, it is useful. It was crafted because the true version of my story teaches an uncomfortable lesson. Power does not simply conquer land. Power conquers meaning. And the conquest of meaning lasts longer than the conquest of cities. Start with a simple definition. What is an empire? It is not a flag. It is not a speech about destiny. An empire is a hunger with administration. It is appetite wearing law. And if you want to know what an empire will do next, do not listen to its poetry. Ask what it eats, what it needs, and what it cannot tolerate. Rome needed Egypt. Not because Egypt was pretty, because Egypt was supply, grain, money, ports. A stable machine of production in a world that could not feed itself reliably. Egypt was leverage. Egypt could make Rome's streets calm or make them riot. Rome's leaders understood this. Rome's generals understood this. And Rome's mobs, whether they could name it or not, felt it in their bellies. So when you ask, why Cleopatra? The first answer is not romance. The first answer is, because I sat on a throne that controlled something Rome could not allow to remain independent forever. Now watch the second definition, because it explains the smear that followed. What is propaganda? It is not simply lying. It is the act of renaming so that conquest feels like protection and robbery feels like duty. Propaganda is the conversion of appetite into virtue in the public mind. Rome was very good at it. Here is a test you can use anywhere. When a powerful faction wants something from you, notice whether they argue the mechanism or attack the character. If they can't win by explaining the incentives and constraints, they will win by changing what you are in the story. They will make you a type, a contaminant, a joke, a monster, a seductress. Anything that makes the crowd stop asking, what is being taken and why? That was done to me with impressive discipline. They told you I seduced Julius Caesar. That word is not about sex, it is about status. It means she did not negotiate, she bewitched. She did not persuade, she corrupted. She did not have reasons, she had charms. Seduction is what you say when you cannot admit your champion made a rational alliance with someone you wanted to keep beneath him. Consider Caesar for a moment. Caesar was not a child. Caesar was not naive. Caesar was a predator of opportunity with an army at his back. He did not wander into Egypt and forget where he was. He understood what Egypt was worth. He understood that if Egypt was stable, it could finance him, feed allies, and deny rival factions an opening to use Egypt against him. He understood that Egypt's treasury and supply could turn a contest in Rome into a certainty. And I understood something too. I inherited a kingdom in a world where Rome's shadow covered every coast. You can call that geopolitics if you like. I call it the weather. You don't argue with the weather. You prepare. You build. You make alliances. You choose days and seasons carefully. And you never confuse your wishes with the shape of reality. So, Caesar and I made an alliance. Not a poem. An alliance. Egypt would not be treated as a carcass to be carved by Roman factions. In exchange, Caesar would get what he needed. Stability and advantage. That's what happened. That's the boring, true version. And Octavian's later story couldn't tolerate how boring it was, because boredom suggests competence. It suggests I was a ruler doing ruler's work. So they made it scandal. They made it a story about appetite and weakness, because that story protects Roman pride. It tells Romans that their leaders are only ever defeated by vice, not by calculation. It tells Romans that foreign rulers do not have skill. They have tricks. Now take the next step. Caesar dies, and Rome does what Rome always does when it cannot control itself. It calls its internal violence justice, then pretends the blood is cleansing. Rome became a battlefield of factions, and everyone invoked virtue as a shield for appetite. Here is another test, and it is always ugly. When men shout virtue while rearranging power, ask what constraint they are actually submitting to. Who can stop them? What enforces the limit? If the answer is no one, then virtue is decoration. In that world, Egypt could not be neutral. Neutrality is what small things call wisdom. Large predators call it weakness and take it as permission. So I dealt with Antony. And again, Rome tells you a story that flatters itself and reduces me. She corrupted him. She softened him. She turned him from duty. Notice the pattern. Rome cannot say, Antony made a rational choice and lost. That would make Rome's civil war Rome's responsibility. It would mean Roman men destroyed Roman order. That's too honest. So Octavian made Antony a victim of an Eastern woman. Because if Antony is a victim, then Octavian becomes a savior. And if Octavian becomes a savior, then his seizure of the state becomes acceptable. Don't miss the mechanism. It's the same every time. Convert a contest for power into a contest for purity. Once you do that, your rival is no longer just wrong. Your rival is contaminating. And contamination justifies measures that would otherwise look like tyranny. This is where Octavian shows his genius. Not genius of philosophy, genius of control. He understood that the Roman people were exhausted. They were tired of civil war. They wanted order. They wanted bread. They wanted the streets to stop shaking. And when people want order badly enough, they will accept a new master, if the new master can convince them the old disorder was caused by an external rot. So Octavian made me the rot. He did not say, I want the crown. He said, I want to save Rome from humiliation. He did not say, I will dismantle the old constraints. He said, I will restore virtue. He did not say, I will remove my rivals. He said, I will protect you from a foreign queen who has bewitched a Roman. That is not merely rhetoric. That is a weapon. It is a weapon because it changes the standard by which actions are judged. Under a political standard, you ask, what are the terms? What are the incentives? Who benefits? What is the cost? Under a purity standard, you ask, who is loyal? Who is tainted? Who must be removed? Purity questions don't end. They escalate. They metastasize. And they make ordinary people accept extraordinary control. Now, I'm going to resist the easy framing you want. You want me to say, Rome was evil and I was noble. That is children's history. It recruits. It doesn't diagnose. Rome was not a cartoon villain. Rome was a machine. It had virtues that served conquest, discipline, coordination, ruthlessness, patience, and it had vices that served conquest, greed, vanity, cruelty, hypocrisy. A machine can contain both. The question is not whether Rome had virtues. The question is, what were the virtues for? What did they enforce? What did they protect? Here is your next test. Whenever someone praises virtue, ask, virtue in service of what order? Because many virtues are simply excellences of predation. A wolf has virtues too: speed, coordination, endurance. Do not confuse ability with goodness. So when Actium comes, And you want your neat moral lesson, decadence losing to discipline. I will not give it to you. Actium was not a judgment from the gods. It was a contest of preparation and coherence. Rome had a single center of command. Rome had a clear story for its soldiers. Rome had a leader who understood how to turn war into identity. And our side had divided loyalties, competing priorities, and the slow corrosion that comes when two courts must pretend to be one. War punishes division the way fire punishes wet wood, not out of morality, out of physics. And then the end arrives. Rome doesn't merely want victory. It wants theatre. It wants the parade. Because a parade is not celebration. It is instruction. It teaches the crowd what happens to those who resist. It makes future resistance feel futile before it begins. Octavian had every incentive to want me alive for that reason. Not to talk to me, not to bargain, to display me, to make me a prop in his story of restoration. And that is where my final act becomes clearer if you refuse poetry. You've heard the tale of the asp. It may be true. It may be a clean myth later storytellers found useful. But the mechanism does not require the snake. The mechanism is this. I refuse to become Rome's teaching tool. I refuse to be made into a public object whose humiliation would lubricate Octavian's rise. Was that pride? Call it what you like. I call it sovereignty in the only form left. When you cannot control the outcome, you can sometimes control the terms. And sometimes, denying the victor the spectacle is the only remaining weapon. Now comes the part that matters most for you, because this is where the conquest becomes permanent. Once I was gone, Octavian annexed Egypt. He took the treasury. He took the grain. He took the administrative spine of a kingdom and folded it into Rome's appetite. And then he did something more decisive than any tax decree. He annexed the story. He made sure that the world would remember Cleopatra not as a sovereign defending a state, but as a seductress who toppled men. Why does that matter? Because if I am remembered as a seductress, the lesson becomes trivial. Be careful of desire. Be careful of women. Be careful of foreigners. That lesson serves Rome. It points away from Rome's hunger and toward a moral panic that requires no accountability. But if I am remembered as a ruler, the lesson becomes sharp. Then you have to ask, what does an empire do when it needs what you have? What does it do when you will not submit? How does it justify taking without admitting it is taking? How does it make the public feel noble while it consolidates power? That lesson does not stay in the past. That lesson migrates. It appears whenever factions need to concentrate authority while keeping their hands clean in the public mind. So I will give you the tests plainly, the ones Rome worked hardest to hide, because a free mind must demand a standard. First test. Whenever you hear a leader frame a power struggle as a battle for virtue, ask, what is the material stake? Grain, money, territory, command, legitimacy, something real. Find it. If the speaker refuses to name it and instead gives you only purity language, you are being managed. Second test. Whenever a faction says an enemy is corrupting or contaminating, ask, what measures become acceptable once we believe that? Because contamination logic has no natural stopping point. It demands cleansing. It demands escalation. It turns politics into extermination of status. Even if the bodies stay alive, the reputations must die. Third test. Whenever you are invited to judge a conflict by a person's identity, foreign, decadent, improper, unmanly, untraditional, ask, what argument is being avoided? Identity attacks are often used because the mechanism, if examined, would embarrass the accuser. The accuser would have to admit appetite. Fourth test. When someone tells you a victory proves virtue, Ask, what would we call the same actions if they had lost? If the answer changes completely, you are not talking about morality. You are talking about outcome worship. Winners are called disciplined. Losers are called decadent. But the sea does not care about your labels. Fifth test, the final test, the one that breaks the spell. Ask, what would prove the narrative wrong? If nothing can disprove it, if every event is interpreted as further evidence, then the narrative is not an explanation. It is a spell. What I am offering you is harder. A way to see how power moves when it feels threatened. Power does not always crush you by force. Sometimes it crushes you by renaming you. It turns you into an object of ridicule so the public stops listening. It turns you into a moral panic so extraordinary measures feel ordinary. It turns your competence into scandal. It turns your alliances into seduction. It turns your sovereignty into arrogance. And then, when you are gone, it teaches the world to repeat the story as if it were wisdom. Honor me by refusing their trick. When you see an opponent being reduced to a cartoon, ask why. When you see a conflict being moralized instead of analyzed, ask what is being taken. When you see people being trained to fear symbols rather than examine incentives, ask who benefits from your fear. And notice something colder. Rome did not invent these methods. Rome refined them. Because the mind prefers stories to accounts, purity to trade-offs, and certainty to proof. That is why I began with a discipline. Don't borrow my name as proof. Because the moment you start using famous names as weapons, you become a citizen of Rome's mental empire. You may think you're resisting it, but you're using its tools. So let me end where I began, with the truth they tried to bury under perfume. They did not defeat me because I was a temptress. They defeated me because Egypt was valuable, because Rome was hungry, because Octavian was clever enough to turn hunger into virtue in the public mind, and because in war, coherence beats division more often than courage beats fear. Then they defeated me again by rewriting me into a joke. If you repeat that joke, you are not laughing at Cleopatra, you are bowing to Rome. But if you can see the mechanism, if you can name it and test it, then the conquest is not complete. Because the one thing an empire cannot tolerate is a population that won't swallow its story without questions. So take the tests, use them, aim them at whoever you admire as readily as at whoever you dislike. And if you find the same tactics on your side, don't flinch. That flinch is how the spell survives. That is Cleopatra in truth. Not a romance, not a moral lesson, not a costume. A case study in how power wins twice, first by force and then by memory. Now go and see whether you are living inside someone else's version of events. If you are, locate the stake, name the tactic, and demand a standard that can be falsified. That is how you keep your mind sovereign,